We are pleased to welcome Mr. Aravindh Suresh. He's an accomplished professional who studied at the London School of Economics and currently works at Macquarie Groups. With a strong background in finance and economics, Aravind will be presenting an insightful talk on how to get onto the economics education pathway. This session is a valuable opportunity for students interested in pursuing a future in economics to gain practical guidance and inspiration. I know how busy you are, Aravind. Thank you so much for taking this, giving us this opportunity to listen to you. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks for the wonderful introduction, Auntie. Hi, everyone. My name is Aravindh Suresh. You'll see me like this, but I've got my presentation to the side of me here. So if you see me just looking away, that'll be the reason why. Anyway, without further ado, let's get straight into the presentation. So, well, Auntie gave a short introduction about myself. Let me just expand on that just a little bit. So my name is Aravindh Suresh. I have been working now as an infrastructure private equity, I guess, associate at a large investment bank called Macquarie. I've been working there for the past 3 years. Prior to that, I studied economics at the London School of Economics, where I obtained a first class degree. And then prior to that, I did both my GCSEs and A levels in rugby at a school called Lawrence Sheriff School. Besides that, I am also the founder of an educational consultancy called Assure.uk. So, as much as I'm kind of covering some of the key topics around economics here, if you go to either my website or my YouTube link, there'll also be some supplementary videos there, of course, entirely free for you to access. So if we go to the agenda for today, I've kind of split it into two sections. The first is kind of economics as a degree or a career, giving a bit of background as to what economics actually is, how that looks like at A level versus at university, why you might want to study it, a few caveats that people don't necessarily mention, and then what careers are available to you after studying economics. So that'll be part one. And then part two will be, if you think that economics might be for you, these are the things that you need to consider in terms of whilst you're still at school, your GCSEs, A levels, personal statements, and all of that. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to just raise your hand and I'll be happy to answer. We can just do it informally throughout. And I'll also give a very short little talk about kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis um, towards the end as well. So, okay, if we go towards economics as a degree or career, right? Economics, I think, has a tendency to be quite misunderstood or appear quite mysterious on from the outset, especially if you're not familiar with the subject. So, to clear a few things up, right? I think there are a lot of common misconceptions about economics, particularly about what it is. I think if you were to ask anyone on the street, or when I've spoken to students, some of the most common answers are it's about the stock market, or it's about learning how to make money, how to invest, or it's similar to business studies or finance. And I think that a lot of this idea around economics might come from the movies that you potentially associate with economics. It might be something like The Wolf of Wall Street or The Big Short or Wall Street, which are all great movies, but the stock market is a very small element of what economics actually is. So if we go to the reality of things, economics is a lot more than just the stock market. Economics is effectively a study about the allocation of resources. It's about the idea that there are scarce or a limited number of resources on this planet, but there are infinite human wants or desires. And so it's a question of, given those two things are at odds with each other, how do we allocate resources effectively? So it looks at, how we produce them, how we distribute them, how we consume resources. And just on the right, this is a chart. Um, it's quite relevant right now, but this is a chart talking about the impact of tariffs and what that means in terms of supply, pricing, demand, etc. So if you were to study economics, you'd be able to understand what this chart were implying, and therefore might be able to help you better understand something like the Trump tariffs that are going on today. So let's look at economics at A level versus at university. And there is quite a big difference in kind of the style of what is taught between the two. So at A level, it's probably going to be your very first introduction to economics as a subject that you would study. And in terms of what you learn, the teaching or the majority of it is basically looking at the initial concepts of economics at a very high level. You don't go too much into too much detail. You don't do too much maths at the very most, it's probably GCSE level. And the focus is on understanding the basic theory and learning to apply it, not on proving that that theory is actually true. The exams typically are more essay based. So rather than doing lots and lots of maths, you'll be writing essays on the impact of a certain policy or talking about a certain theory. And so the below is the specification that I did, which is still the current one, which is the EdXL A level specification. And so there, across your 2 years, your AS and your A level year, you'll cover things like markets, market failure, the UK and the global economy, and business behavior. And so you cover all of these different things. You actually cover quite a lot, but you do it at, in pretty little detail. You just kind of get the gist of the underlying theory. Whereas when you go to university, the focus of university is to actually cover fewer things. So you'll actually touch on fewer topics than you do at A level, for example, but you do them in significantly more detail. So you kind of utilize or you look further into the theories that you've already been taught, but you try and relate it back or marry it up with the maths. So there is a much more numerical sense to studying economics at university level, and so it's desirable for you as a student to have strong math skills if it's something that you want to pursue. As I mentioned, you'll go through fewer concepts, but in more detail. And the majority of your exams will also be more maths based. And so the screenshot below, although it isn't my handwriting, is quite literally from one of the modules that I took in my second year of university. So it's a kind of a similar chart to the one that you see on the right from the previous page, but all of a sudden you've got a lot more maths behind it with differentiation and ratios and things like that. So, if we look at a sample university course, just to give you a flavor of what you might touch upon, economics is typically a 3 year degree. It might be a 4 year degree if you choose to do something like an industrial placement or a year abroad. But if we quickly go through what you do in each of the years, in your first year, you'll normally, or at least this is what happened for me at LSE, in your first year, you do a quick refresh. Of the concepts or skills that you're taught in further maths and statistics and things like that. That might cover a couple of weeks. And by the end of your first term, you'll have built on these skills and have learned more skills. And then in your second term, you'll start applying these skills towards actual economics. For example, you'll start doing supply and demand curves that you'd normally just kind of draw in A level economics. You'd instead start using equations to describe them instead. In your second year, having now got a solid base of skills in your first year, you start applying that maths to more economic scenarios. So you look primarily at three things. The first will be macroeconomics, which is a study of the kind of entire economy as a whole. So that's on a high level basis. That's things like GDP, interest rates, inflation. The second is microeconomics, where you're looking more specifically at the interactions between customers or consumers and the firm and industries. How are prices set? How are industry structures established? Do you have lots of firms or do you have one or two large monopolies? Those sorts of questions. And finally, you start looking into econometrics. Which is the use of statistical methodology and applying it to real world data to try and see if there are actual real world correlations between the theories that you've been taught. For example, you might get real world data and use statistical methodology to prove out the idea that as a family gets more income, they might spend more. You'd support that using kind of statistical methods to prove that out. I've circled or I've highlighted what I call year 2.5, which is obviously your year abroad or your placement year. Um, Normally, that kind of comes outside of the scope of your degree, in the sense that in a lot of occasions, what you get up to that year does not count towards your degree classification, the score that you get for your degree. So you can choose to go abroad and study at a different institution and benefit from the teaching and the courses that are taught there. For example, your university might not teach certain courses, and that might be available to you at a different university abroad. Or you can go and do an industrial placement, which is kind of working for an industry. It could be in economics, it could be in finance, it could be in accounting, it could be in whatever you kind of want. And the idea there is that you will kind of learn real life skills that will help you once you graduate. Just thing to note, I think a lot of people, well, some people find it attractive when they're first applying, but just realize that it is an extra year of university. And then the year that you come back, your friends may have graduated, so you'll need to make new friends. So that's just kind of one thing that people don't really consider. So I just want to stress upon you now. And then there's your final year. And final year, at least for me, was academically probably the most enjoyable year in the sense that your first 1 and 2 years are very much a slog in terms of learning the really hard nitty-gritty mathematical and statistical skills. And in your third year, it's all about applying them and getting the real life context. So you start applying those skills to particular sub areas of the economy. So I, for example, I did international economics, industrial economics, development economics, and I did a finance module. But all of those things utilize the skills that I developed over the 2 years prior. So economics, why should you study it? And I've tried to synthesize it down into these key 5 points. So, firstly, is that economics broadly underpins the world or society we live in. So, if read or watch the news, the majority of the headlines that you read will have some sort of economic background to it. For example, the tariffs that Trump has announced, the entire reason is to try and promote, in principle, the economy, the American economy. You'll see things about interest rates moving by the Bank of England, which again, the rationale for that is based in economics. The second is that you'll learn why people, businesses, and governments make certain choices. So, if you notice that pricing of goods has increased, or if you notice that there are lots of businesses who offer a certain service, it will give you the skills that you need to try and understand why those things are happening the way they are. And that brings me to my third point, which is to develop the critical thinking and analysis skills. With economics, kind of the key point or focus of the course is really to try and better understand the causes of things. And so you start really to think quite logically, to think in a structured way. And that does translate across into when you start working. I think it really does instill a certain mindset in you that translates well when you start your job. The course itself is normally very well rounded. Economics itself, you touch upon a lot of different things just by nature of what the course is. And often you do have access to do modules in things that are a little bit tangential as well. So at LSE, I had the opportunity to study finance modules or history modules or accounting modules because all of them, in some sense, can have a link back into economics anyway. And the fifth, and I'm sure something that people are probably pretty interested in, is that economics generally has very, very good career prospects. When I was applying, I think economics was the second highest paying undergraduate degree after mathematics. So yeah, it has very good prospects, especially within the world of business. That being said, there are a few caveats, a few things that you probably ought to know. So when you study economics at a university level, you suddenly go from, as I mentioned, at A level, you're doing a lot of theory, a lot of conceptual stuff. When you go to university, it becomes a lot more maths based. And sometimes that maths can get very theoretical or very abstract. And so it can be difficult to grasp concepts immediately. So you need to be able to kind of conceptualize or have a little bit of intuition to really do well at this degree, or at least to understand what you're being taught. Leading on from that, as I kind of have alluded to over the past few pages, there is a strong focus on maths and statistics as well. So and kind of the careers as well that lead off of that tend to be based in maths and statistics as well. So if that isn't your strong point, an economics degree may not necessarily be the one for you. Thirdly, in a weird sense, economics is a bit of a signaling degree. And what I kind of mean by that is when you compare it to other degrees like a medicine or something like a computer science, the technical skills that you build or the translation of skills that you learn to the real world are kind of limited because so much of it is rooted in theory. Instead, having an economics degree from a prestigious university acts as a signal um, to employers that you are smart and intelligent. As I mentioned before, the way when you study economics, your mindset is kind of shifted into a certain way, and that's kind of what they're looking for. Um, but the actual theory or economic theory that you're learning has kind of limited practical applicability in the real world. And so what I mean by that is I work at an investment bank, I work in investments, and very little of what I do on a day-to-day basis kind of translates from or is derived from what I've learned from my degree. The fourth thing is that economics as a degree is very competitive to get into, but also the really great career prospects that come from it are also very competitive to get into. And finally, is that to get into the careers opportunities that economics offers, you don't necessarily have to do economics. There are plenty of other careers, plenty of other degrees, sorry, that also provide the same pathways or provide the same opportunities to you. For example, a finance degree or an accounting degree, a maths degree, a computer science degree, all of those things will probably give more or less the same opportunities to you after you graduate. So this is probably going to be the most attractive or interesting slide to many of you, which is the careers after studying economics. So I've listed a few of these here. Um, at LSE, for example, most people typically get into the first three, which is investment banking, investing, or consulting. I myself am in an investment role, as I mentioned earlier. So I'll just get straight to the point. The salaries are very attractive or very lucrative, um, or can be. But I also want you to pay attention to that second or third column, which is the typical hours per week, noting that investment banking, investment roles, these can get up to 80 hours per week. Um, so that is sometimes 12 to 14-hour days. For example, the week just gone, I probably averaged a 1 a.m. finish most days. And then, a week or two before that, when it was the Easter bank holiday weekend, I worked both sets of the bank holidays. So I worked Good Friday and Easter Monday, as well as the weekend. So things can get hectic, and you are paid well, but you also have to work for it accordingly. So don't just look at the graduate starting salary. Also, please do factor in the hours per week as well. And as I mentioned before, most of these careers are accessible from other degrees as well. So it's not necessary that you have to do economics to gain access to these career paths. What I will say is that the higher paying of those career opportunities I highlighted, your university choice does matter. Unlike a degree such as medicine, with economics, your university really can have an impact on just how easy it is to get access or get offers to those really lucrative, high-paying jobs. Um, I'm obviously divulging a bit here because, funnily enough, I haven't actually highlighted economist as a career. If you did want to if you did want to become an economist, I'll just flag you would do your undergraduate degree, but normally at the very least, you then also have to do a master's degree and then potentially also a PhD. Where again, how far up you progress does also depend on the quality of your university, but particularly when it comes to getting into finance, your university effectively acts as a signal of your intelligence. If you go to a top ranking university, the bank or the consulting firm is immediately kind of just going to think, oh, this person is smart, this person's clever, this person is likely to do well. And so, in a sense, they tend to focus their recruitment more on a certain set of universities. And within the industry, this is called target and semi-target universities. So the target universities are probably the ones that you've heard of, the very, very prestigious, normally high ranking in terms of the university league table sets of universities. So that would be something like Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, UCL, Warwick. And so if you look at the investment banking or consulting graduate cohorts who enter these prestigious firms every single year, the bulk or majority of them will probably come from these five, maybe six universities. There's a rung below that, For example, and by the way, all of this is it's not a hard and fast list. This is just kind of typically what I have seen from my experience. Um, there is a rung below the target universities, for example, the University of Nottingham or the University of Bath, where it's still possible to get into, for example, investment banking or consulting, but it is less likely, it's less probable because the majority of the applications typically are filled up by the target universities first. And just at the bottom there, all of these universities, both the target and semi-target universities, require excellent A levels, typically AAA at the very minimum. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right, okay. That's not the case. I'll keep going on. So, look, if you do want to kind of enter, let's work backwards. So, if you want to get into some of these career fields, the best thing you can do is to go to a target university. And to go to a target university, we're now going to walk through what exactly can you do or what are the universities looking for. So if we go to your GCSEs and A levels, universities will look at both. It depends how much based on each university. For example, I believe Oxford looks at your GCSEs and A levels quite a bit, whereas maybe LSE only looks at your A levels, for example, and not doesn't pay that much attention to GCSEs. I'm just conjecturing, but it does depend on university. Anyhow, at a GCSE level, there are no particular set of GCSEs that you need to take. The most important thing are the grades that you get in your GCSEs. If you look at the likes of Oxford, Cambridge, or LSE, the majority of people there have been high performers throughout their time at school. And at GCSE, they probably got mostly nines and eights across the board. Given the emphasis of economics and more and also in finance of maths, your ability to have a strong grade in maths GCSE is quite important. It is still possible to get into a top tier target university with a more average set of GCSEs, but you're just making your life more difficult. So if you've got more average GCSEs, it means you have to make up for it either in your A levels or in your personal statement when you're applying to university. And just to give an anecdote, I've been working with someone as part of Assure to do that, where the person had an average set of GCSEs, but we really worked on their A levels, their personal statement, their work experience, and they ultimately got an offer from Imperial. So it is possible. You just need to put in more work later down the line. As a small side note, if you do have the option to take business studies at a GCSE level, I would encourage that you take it. I've personally found that some of the concepts that they taught early on that you learn in year nine and year 10 are still applicable to me today. For example, revenue, costs, types of business, etc., still get used in both in economics and also in the financial kind of industry more generally. At A levels, the subject selection matters a lot more. I feel like I'm making this point again and again, but maths is required by almost all universities, and for your top target universities, the majority of them like to see further maths in some level. If your school doesn't offer the further maths full A level, even if you do it at an AS level, that's normally okay. I know friends who got into LSE that way. Economics is not technically necessary at most universities. If you look at the entry requirements, it's not needed to have studied economics prior to joining the university. But again, I think it is quite helpful for you to get a grounding of the theory before you actually start doing the maths behind that at university level. If you have the option to do an EPQ and you feel like you'll be able to maintain your grades, I'd suggest you do it, especially if your question is related to something on economics. So for context or as an example, I did two EPQs actually. I did one in year 10 and then one in year 12/13. My first one was the impact of Brexit, and the second one was a comparison of cryptocurrencies versus normal currency. So both of them had links into economics, and that kind of helped me with my personal statement down the line. If you're not really too sure what else to take besides maths and or maybe further maths, check the university websites, or there is a list of things, or there used to be a list of subjects called facilitating subjects, where the universities would kind of prefer them or saw them as a sign of strong academic performance. Those are things kind of like sciences or humanities like geography or history. If you can take those, they are normally pretty safe bets as your third subject, for example. When it comes to applying to university for economics, as with every other degree, you will have to submit a personal statement. What is the personal statement? It is a 4,000 character document where you outline your motivations for studying the subject at a university level, and you also highlight why you think you are a strong candidate or you are a strong fit to study that particular degree. And so recently, for the 2026 entry, so for anyone who's applying to university from this year onwards, we actually restructured it into three questions. Which the first is, why do you want to study this course? The second is, how have your qualifications and studies helped you? And the third is, what else have you done to prepare outside of education? So, in bucket number one or question number one, you should kind of talk about where your interest for economics comes from. So, it might be from reading books, it might be from listening to podcasts, any real life events that you've attended, or scenarios that you've seen. So, it could literally be something as simple as you're really interested in the tariffs that have just come on, or the kind of Cold War, for lack of a better word, that's going on between the US and China right now, or you're interested in the EU and the developments that have been happening in the EU more recently. Anything like that can spark your interest in economics, and you might want to talk about that. And as part of that, if you think you've learned things that are outside the scope or quite interesting about economics, it might be that you're particularly interested in the causes of economic depressions or why recessions happen, and you've done a little bit of study into that area, you can mention things like that and why you find it interesting. The second area of how have your qualifications and studies helped you prepare. In this section, and obviously all of this is kind of conjecture again because this is the first year that anyone's ever doing it, but if this were me, this is how I would do it. You should show that you thought about how your subjects relate or will aid your future study. So at A level, you normally take three or four subjects, and so have a think about how those subjects relate to economics. So if it's maths, it's pretty straightforward. You will develop the skills that you kind of need to be a great economist. If it's something like history, you can talk about how economics has presented itself in history. There are patterns of history that show periods of poor or good of poor or good economy and how that translates. Even if it's something like music, you can talk about how in music there are certain relationships between notes that form a chord or that form a scale, and how you need to strictly adhere to those requirements in order for music to sound good. In the same way, there are certain economic policies that need to be adhered to for the economy to run well. And then finally, what else have you done to prepare outside of education? Here, it's anything that you've kind of done holistically, um, in addition to any of the reading that you've talked about before that you think will further supplement. So this is kind of talking about you as a person and why you think you'd be a good university student, why you'd be a good contribution to that university. But also, if there's anything you haven't mentioned in kind of sections one or sections two, you can also kind of bung it into here as well. For example, you might talk about books and podcasts in your question one, but you haven't talked about work experience. You can probably put that into your section three. I see we've got a couple of questions, so let me just answer them whilst we're here. Okay, so the first question, which I think is a really good question, is if we're not able to get economics in a target university, is it worth taking a course like PPE, which is economic psychology and philosophy, although in Warwick rather than studying economics in a university like Southampton? So I think there's two elements to that question. The first is how much do you actually like those other subjects? So PPE, by the way, is normally, and I believe at Warwick is philosophy, politics, and economics. And it's not normally psychology. Normally isn't included. Um, but anyhow, it really depends on how much you like the other um, the other two subjects here. Because ultimately, you've got to study that degree for a period of 3 to 4 years. And so, if you really don't like psychology or philosophy or politics, then it can kind of be very difficult for you to get a good grade in, and you will not enjoy your time at university, and it is a large commitment. That being said, from a pure careers prospect element, I would agree with what you're saying. Even if you do a degree like PPE at Warwick and you genuinely like or don't mind studying PPE, the University of Warwick name will carry itself stronger than the University of Southampton, despite studying economics at Southampton. The next question is further maths isn't a prerequisite mentioned in the target universities, but do you think it is an implicit factor in getting chosen to the target universities? Is it not enough to take maths, history, geography, one foreign language, and an EPQ on economics? So when I was applying for LSE, I can't remember if I did it or one of my friends did it, but someone did an information of data request to understand what percentage of the previous year's cohorts who had gotten in took further maths. And the number was quite significant. And so, in that sense, even though it's not listed in the entry requirements, I think that further maths one is helpful in terms of just getting in to the university. I think the universities do actually like it, even if they don't necessarily state it. But also, when it comes to actually doing the degree, further maths is probably one of the building blocks of doing a degree of economics at LSE. If you didn't do further maths, it's going to be really hard for you to keep up with the content because so much of it is mathsy. So I would highly suggest that you do further maths, whether it's a prerequisite or not, just because it's kind of what you're going to need in order to sort of succeed or increase your probability of succeeding once you're at university, especially if you're at one of those target universities. And then, is there any reason why you did two EPQs compared to one? Yes. So this was partly off the advice when I was in the sixth form of my head of sixth form. At school, we had the opportunity to do an EPQ at a GCS. Had the opportunity to do an EPQ even before we'd done our GCSEs or as part of our GCSEs. It was the same exact EPQ that you would do in year 12 or year 13. We just had the opportunity to do it earlier. So I did that in year 11. But when applying for Oxford and Cambridge, um, my head of sixth form was a bit concerned that because I'd done my EPQ so long ago, they may not consider it. And so she suggested that I just do another one just to be it safe. And I was confident that I would be able to get the grade, top grades. So I just kind of challenged myself to do another EPQ and I broadly enjoyed it. So I didn't really see too much of an issue. Um, do combined economics degrees hold the same weight and value as pure economics? I guess that question depends on for what purpose. For getting into an investment bank or a consulting firm, yeah, as long as it's at a target university. I know plenty of people who got in to an investment bank having done philosophy and economics, or politics and economics, or maths and economics, or geography and economics. So I don't think there's any more or less weight. Maybe economics is harder to get into at an undergraduate level, but when it comes to career applications, I don't think so. Um, as a general rule, I think the name of your university, weirdly enough, when it comes to banking and consulting, matters more than the degree. I've seen people from Imperial who did chemical engineering get into investment banking because a lot of the things that you learn or need to get into investment banking or consulting can be learned very easily outside of your degree. And then last question for now is how important are predicted grades from the year 12 exams for getting into target universities? And how likely is it to get into the target unis if the grades aren't the best? So the predicted grades from your year 12 exams are ultimately what is utilized on your or what is sent across to the universities. And so I think it is quite important that they are ideally as high as they possibly can be because that is forms a large basis of how the universities make their decision. For example, LSE, when I was applying, required A star AA. And so if you're only predicted three A's, then immediately LSE may not necessarily provide you that offer because they will, be uncertain or kind of have their doubts as to whether you'll even be able to make the entry requirement. Um, so in that sense, you ideally want your predicted grades to be as good as they possibly can be. How likely is it to get into the target universities if the grades are not the best? Also, I think it is quite difficult, to be honest, or to be candid, if your target grades aren't great. I guess it depends. If you've had really strong GCSEs, but then your target grades are um, a little low, they might consider that, or they might want more context. And they'll also take into account how the school provides predicted grades anyway. Some schools are more conservative than others in terms of their target grades. And so I do believe that that is also noted. But I think that's all the questions for now. I'll keep going, and then if there are any more, feel free to ask. If anyone wants to just also jump onto mic, and we can have a discussion about it, that's also absolutely okay. So going back to the presentation. So on the personal statement, here is a suggested plan of action on how I would develop a personal statement. So step number one is I'd suggest that you just brainstorm. First and foremost, just brainstorm and jot down on a piece of paper or on a Word document everything noteworthy that you think you've done since, call it year nine. So that could be any competitions that you've participated in, any leadership roles, things if you've been a prefect or a sports captain, any work experience that you've done, even if it doesn't immediately relate to economics, you can kind of shift it in a way that it relates to economics. And then finally, what subjects you've taken, and if there were any parts of the syllabus or the specification that you found particularly interesting, or where you think there might be a link into economics, for example. Once you've done that, the next thing I want you to do is to categorize all those bullet points into those three questions and think about how those bullet points might slot together. So, for example, I've just put down as a sample for question one, why study this subject? It could be a real life world event. Number one might be you found a discussion of around US tariffs pretty interesting. And then you might read a book that taught you about trade policy, or if you found the tariffs interesting, that might have led you to read something more about it, and that taught you about how trade policy works. And then after reading that book, you might have read something about currency. For question two, how have your qualifications helped? Kind of as I alluded to before, you might say, maths has provided you with a grounding of statistical methods. Obviously, if you study economics before university, you have a grasp of the key theories. And just to throw a spanner in the works, as I mentioned before, music, you might be familiar with with the concept of rules or adhering to certain relationships in order to form a chord or a key, and the idea that you understand that those things will also translate to the world of economics, for example, where certain things have to adhere to certain rules for the economy to function. And question three, which is kind of anything else, you might want to talk about work experience where you saw real world use of economic skills, or you might have been a team captain and how that built decision making, leadership, and resilience skills, all of which will help you as a university student. And then the final thing is once you've categorized it, is I want you to then expand your bullet points into full-fledged sentences. And so here I provided a sample about talking about work experience. And this is about working at Tesco. And here you can see that I've thrown in a bunch of language that relates to economics, even though I'm basically describing a shelf stacking role at Tesco. And so that's why I'm highlighting or emphasizing that your work experience can kind of be about anything when it comes to economics, because economics has a role in just about everything. So it's just a matter of you identifying where economics has played a part in whatever work experience you've done. When it comes to top target universities, entrance exams and interviews are becoming an increasingly present part of that application process. So if we look at entrance exams first, they're not the most widespread, but they are becoming increasingly required. The most common of these is the TMUA, which is the test of mathematics for university admission. It was originally only required by Cambridge, but more recently, I think LSE and UCL have both also made it mandatory as well. The TMUA largely utilizes the maths that you're taught as part of your A level school curriculum. And so to prepare, I would suggest that you look at the TMUA specification. They have some notes on their website of what you need to be familiar with. From there, identify which parts of that specification that you are confident in and perhaps which parts you need to do more work in and work on those parts. Do the questions from your test book related to that TMUA spec. And then when it comes to actual doing practice, I would suggest that you actually do the MAT and the CSAT papers because these are harder than the actual TMUA. And so when you practice those, when it comes to doing the actual TMUA, you'll find it really easy. And also give yourself plenty of time. Normally, these entrance exams are mid to late October. And I think when I started prepping for these, I probably started slowly and gradually looking into them from mid-August to or end of August. So I gave myself about 2 months runway to prep myself for these exams. Finally, or rather, the final stage of some university applications for economics is the interview. Normally, this is only done at Oxford and Cambridge. And the things they might test you on are basic motivational questions. So, why do you want to do economics? What first interested you? What would you do with your degree once you graduate? And all of these are things that you should have considered when writing your personal statement anyway. So, you should kind of already have the answers to these as part of the application process. They might test your broader understanding. So, what's going on in the world? What are the biggest issues that you see? Is it AI? Is it tariffs? Is it global warming? Is it something else that you think? Anything like that. They may test your basic understanding of economics. For example, they might get you to draw a supply and demand curve, which is probably the most simplistic kind of model that you learn. And they might ask you about what happens if certain things change. You should also prepare your maths. The questions won't be, straightforward maths questions. They won't ask you to do a multiplication or a differentiation. It won't be that explicit. Instead, they will provide context. For example, they might give you a graph. For me, it was a graph showing the relationship between fertilizer and crop production. And it was just a curve, and you had to basically identify what the optimal amount of fertilizer to use was, as an example. And so that required a bit of differentiation and things like that. They may also ask some math-based brain teasers. And so an example that one of my friends got is on screen here. There are n red and n green balls and two jars. Someone is going to choose one of the jars at random and then a ball at random from that jar. Arrange the balls to maximize the probability that the person chooses a red ball. So it's a bit of a brain teaser. It does require some maths, some understanding of probability. If anyone is courageous enough, feel free to note that down or take a screenshot. And if you're able to answer that, I will be very impressed. Um, and so, how do you prepare for the interviews and the entrance tests? Broadly, I would define it as a bit of a cyclical process. So the aim is not to be amazing at it on day one, it's to kind of incrementally improve. So you focus on your weakest weaknesses, you start early, and then I have this little triangle here, right? So this reinforcing little cycle. So you want to do as much research as possible. So for example, when it comes to the TMUA, learning about the spec, learning about what things will come up. And then it's the second stage is doing practice. Once you've done your practice, you can identify which bits you're actually strong at and which bits you're struggling at, and then you can refine your strategy accordingly. For example, you might realize that you're weak on integration, and so you might need to spend more time research. You might need to spend more time working on integration, or it might be your time management, and you need to spend more time there. And then that repeats itself. You can do more research about how to get better at integration or how to get better at time management. You do your practice, you refine your strategy again and again and again until you've honed your craft and you're feeling confident for the final test or the final interview. So, in terms of tests and interviews, in terms of research, you can look at for tests, what existing material there is, or you can speak to other people and ask them about their experiences. Um, When it comes to interviews, you want to research the university, you want to research the subject, and you want to understand the typical questions that might come up um, for your subject. Um, in terms of practice, you then for tests want to look at what sort of questions might come up. What are you finding hard? How are you doing with time management? For interviews, it's asking yourself, do you know your stuff? How is my body language? How is my tone? How is the clarity of my answers? And then in terms of refinement, it's how can I play to my strengths? For example, in a test, you might find that if you do a certain set of questions or a certain type of questions first, you're really confident with those and you can get those done really quickly, and that makes you more confident for the rest of your test. And then the last slide is a bit of a generalistic example of a revision technique, one that I would really recommend, and I believe has been covered in previous sessions, which is spaced repetition. It's a really well known effective study technique, which is the idea that when you first learn something, it will be fresh in your head, but over time, your memory of the content will decrease. And so you have to strategically relearn it. And so over time, you'll be able to retain that information for longer and longer periods. And so how I did it was I would first go through a chapter or a subsection um, of a subject multiple times. The first time I would just read through, and the focus or my focus was just on understanding the content and making sure that it all made sense in my head. The second time, I would go through it in more detail and try and memorize the key points. And as I was going along, I would try and think of the key points in a sort of bullet point form. So maybe I'd read 3 or 4 pages and I'd condense it down into 8 to 10 bullet points and try and remember those bullet points in order. The next thing I would do is jot down everything I could remember about those 4 pages. I would try and record the bullet points I'd created in my previous step, and wherever I'd forgotten a point, I would highlight it. For example, let's say I got steps 1 to 7, got 8, missed out 9, and then got 10. So then I would have forgotten step 9. I would have gone back to step 9 or section 9 of that four of those 4 pages and spent more time there, trying to make sure that I really understood that point or making sure that I would remember that. And then I would rejot everything down, see if I got all 10, and then repeat again and again and again. And what I would then do is I'd kind of keep a list of passings. So what I mean by that is I'd keep a tally of how many times I'd covered or revisited a particular topic. For example, I'm for economics, I might have covered chapter 1 once, chapter 2 3 times. And then what I would do is I would just revisit past sections intermittently to see how much I could remember. I would just sometimes, even without opening the book up, I would just try and recall how many, as many of the bullet points as I possibly could. I might remember that there were 10 bullet points and I only got 7. And so I knew that there were 3 missing that I then need to go back to. Finally, I would try and reinforce my knowledge or my understanding by doing practice questions. Practicing questions will help you retain that knowledge because it forces you to apply what you've learned. And whenever you apply what you learn, I think it really does embed that knowledge into your head. And then I would also develop a revision timetable that ultimately enabled me to do spaced repetition. So for me, I based mine on a school day. So for at my school, there were 6 lessons in a day, and what I would effectively do is I would just extend out my timetable to have an additional 3 lessons, each an hour each an hour in length in the evening. So I would have 3 lessons out till lunchtime. I'd have lunch, another 3 lessons. School would end. I'd take a break, and then I have another 3 lessons. And I would choose those 3 lessons based on the difficulty of the school day or what subjects I'd done that day at school. For example, if I'd had 2 hours of maths that day, I was probably going to be a bit exhausted of doing maths, and so I might choose to do economics in the evening instead. Or if I had English one day for 2 or 3 hours, then there wasn't a chance that I was going to touch English in the evening, and so I would reward myself with subjects that I liked more, so with maths or science in the evenings, and so my day would be well rounded that way. And that would be my way of doing spaced repetition. I realized that I need to cover also a little bit about kind of a day in my life. So to give a bit more background about my job, as I mentioned, I am an associate working at an infrastructure private equity um, firm. what that actually means in reality is that insurance companies or pension companies will provide us with a bunch of money that they would like to invest to see their money grow. The way of pensions or insurance work, as you might know, is that people contribute to their pension every single month, and then once they retire, they expect to get their pension back to support their kind of day-to-day life. And so, when you contribute into your pension, you're hoping that your pension money grows so that you have more money once you retire. And so, it's part of my job to try and invest that money responsibly into investments that I think are good. And so, with infrastructure private equity specifically, what we do is that we invest into these companies are different to publicly listed companies that you see on the stock market. So we don't invest in things like Apple or Amazon or Google. We will try and invest and purchase 100% or near enough 100% of a company. So that will be, for example, a mobile company or a company that owns all the roads in Italy, for example, and we will invest in those companies, try to develop those companies over a period of maybe 10 years. The company's profits we utilize or we extract and pay that back to our investors. And then at the end of those 10 years, we will have hoped to have grown the company and to sell it off for a profit. So it's a little bit similar to how you might see some people buy up an old house that needs a lot of work and buy the house, refurb the house, then they might rent it out for 10 years or so, and then they might sell the house for a profit down the line. We basically do the exact same thing, but instead of a house, we do it with companies instead. On a day-to-day basis, what does that mean for me is I might be analyzing the performance of the companies that we've already invested in. So I'm actually responsible. I'm the asset analyst, or in some cases, the asset manager for a couple of our investments. And so I will be working day to day with the management team. So even myself as a 24-year-old, I'm often speaking to the CEOs, CFOs of these companies to understand the business, how it's performing, if anything's kind of going off track, or if there are any opportunities to further grow the business. We'll discuss it with those teams. We'll run the analysis ourselves just to double check what the company are saying is correct. And we will provide recommendations on what things we think they should be doing to improve their performance if necessary. So that's a part of my job. Another part of my job is to identify new things for us to invest in. And because these are such large sums of money, we need to make sure that we get our investment decision right. Now that doesn't always happen, but for the most part, we want to make sure that we're making as informed of a decision as we possibly can. And so we'll be doing a lot of research. For example, if we want to invest in, as I mentioned before, a company that owns the roads in Italy, I might be doing research about the Italian economy, about Italy's demographics, about how many cars pass through Italy every single year, whether that trend is increasing, anything like that. I might be doing some more research on to help develop an overall thesis as to whether we should invest in that company or not. And finally, towards the end, when we want to sell the company, we will also prepare that company for sale. So we'll develop a business plan. We will reach out to the wider market to see if anyone's interested. We will work with lawyers to get the legal paperwork done. We'll get steps in action for it to be sold, all of that. So there is a really varied set of work that you do on a day to day. It's such a gimmick, but honestly, every single day is completely different to the next. But key things that you kind of do is you would use you. My job heavily relies on Excel to run the analysis. And then from that, after running that analysis, I might jump onto PowerPoint and try and present my findings in a nice, concise manner. Um, and then there's also a lot of client interaction in terms of managing both the senior leaders who are responsible for making investment decisions, but also working with the management teams and sometimes also speaking to our investors directly as well. I think that we're doing well for time. This is pretty much bang on an hour. Um, and that covers broadly everything I wanted to talk about today. Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone want to jump? If anyone wants to just turn on their camera and just chat live, that would also be good.
Thank you so much, Arvind. It's a very informative session. Hope it's useful for everyone.